One of the most common story templates out there is somebody living a detached existence of some sort to believe they are nonetheless contented, only for somebody to come along that completely turns their life upside down and proceeds to show them everything they're missing out on, and that the world can actually be a pretty great place to live in. Now, there are many different names and terms to describe this template, but for the purposes of this video, I'll be referring to it as a regaining humanity story, as that is essentially what the template is all about. The main character learning how to be human and appreciate how to live life again. And considering how often this template has been used across pretty much every genre out there, it's most definitely one that appeals to people, since it's a story one can easily relate to with how monotonous life can be sometimes. Now, at this point, such a template might be considered extremely cliche, but as I brought up in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, that isn't always a bad thing. But that being said, today I would like to try and take a look at a particular movie that actually manages to subvert the cliches associated with this template, but still get more or less the same point across all the same. And obviously there will be major spoilers for the movie in question ahead, so if there's something you've been meaning to see and don't want ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so the movie in question here is actually 2009's Up in the Air, because at first glance, this movie's plot appears to be establishing a typical regaining humanity story to a T, as our main character is a man whose job is not only to fire people, but he absolutely loves it and is such a workaholic that he openly states that his worst days are the ones where he isn't working. Now, to be completely fair here, it's not like he has any input on who's getting fired in any given situation, as they would be fired regardless. It's just his job to break the news to people gently, so he doesn't exactly relish in ruining people's lives. It's just an occupational hazard in a job he was born to do. But either way, this immediately establishes a man that's about as far removed from human connection as one can possibly get, as he's constantly traveling and thereby never forming any attachments with people, and his singular goal in life is to accumulate enough time travel to get himself exclusive airline perks that have only ever been achieved by about a dozen people. But as I noted before, despite his lonely existence, he openly states that he really couldn't be any happier with his life, at least until the big shakeup inevitably comes along. And this is where the first subversion comes into the conversation, because usually it's the main character's eventual love interest that causes the initial changes in their life. But here, it comes from a new coworker who suggests firing people remotely instead of sending people on location to do it. And while Ryan tries his absolute best to put a stop to that for selfish reasons, as that would mean he'd no longer have to travel all the time, which he sees as the best part of his job, he does also bring up an excellent point that firing people through a screen is a lot colder and less efficient than in person, which is a bit ironic coming from somebody who hasn't formed a human connection in years, but nonetheless, because he actually has a leg to stand on with this argument, he's tasked with taking his coworker, Natalie, around the country to demonstrate his point. And it's while on this trip that he meets the person who truly turns his life upside down and makes him realize just how empty it all is. Because he ends up meeting a woman with a job very similar to his, and ends up forming a deep connection and falling in love with her as a result. And it's through his experience with her, as well as some refreshing youthful idealism from Natalie, that causes him to start reevaluating his own existence. And in the end, after the three spent a lot of time together, Ryan is ultimately vindicated and proven right that firing people remotely doesn't work, and thus keeps his job just the way it was, while Natalie quits to pursue something she finds more fulfilling. But by that point, it all feels like something of a hollow victory for him, as his time with Alex has caused his job to lose a lot of its glamour. So this leads to the obligatory scene where he realizes he wants to spend his life with her, and that the experiences he can have with her are worth way more than his job, and thus goes to her house to pour his heart out to her. But this is where the real subversion comes in. It turns out she's a married woman with a family, causing all of his new dreams to come crashing down on him. And when he later confronts her on it, she makes it clear that she just saw him as one of many random flings she's had and doesn't even understand why he's so upset, even though he has every right to, since she led him on without telling him she was married. But it's after this conversation that the movie subverts itself even further, because one would expect that since the experience in Woman that made him reevaluate his life turned out to be a total sham, his natural reaction would be to embrace his old life for comfort and lead to an even more detached existence, right? Well, that's not what happens, because even after such a blow to his rebudding faith in the world, he still can't bring himself to see things through his old mindset anymore, and notably by the time he does achieve his goal and get the one thing he always dreamed of, he openly says that it doesn't really mean much to him anymore, that it's not nearly as fulfilling as he always dreamed it would be, because he's come to understand that such stuff doesn't really matter, and to that end gives his airline points, which had previously been his most prized possession, to his brother and new wife so they can go on the honeymoon they otherwise couldn't afford, and gives Natalie a glowing review at her new job and thereby allows her to fulfill her new dreams. And in the end, that is what gives him comfort and makes him feel better as the movie ends. The fact that he was able to help the few people he feels a connection to and make them happier. Now, as I just noted, what makes Up in the Air particularly impressive here is that it not only manages to subvert the regaining humanity story template once, but twice. Because at first it looks like him and Alex are going to get together after she shows him how great life can be, but once that all falls apart, he doesn't become even worse than he was at the beginning, and instead is still able to learn from the lessons he was taught and become a more fulfilled human being by the time it's over. And what's particularly notable in this regard is the scene where he confronts Alex on the fact that she didn't tell him she was married, because he seems absolutely disgusted by her nonchalant attitude and confusion over why he's so angry, as well as her offer to basically become her other man. Because once again, in a normal story of this nature, one would expect him to be left a hard-bitten cynic after this scene, but instead it seems to leave him determined not to become like her. Because while he may fire people for a living, that's just his job. He never used people and discarded them like they were one of his old airline tickets like she did, and seems to realize both that that's the final result of living such a detached existence, and that it's a path he doesn't want to go down. But what also helps make this subversion more believable is the character of Natalie, which, as I noted before, is usually not present in a story of this nature. Because while Alex turns out to be a fraud, Natalie is not. She's completely sincere and means absolutely everything she says, and though he finds her idealism and inexperience amusing, it does also start to affect him as the movie goes on. So when everything with Alex falls apart, he still has the connection he formed with his colleague to fall back on and learn something from, because nothing about that was a lie. To put it all another way, instead of being a typical regaining humanity story by having Ryan learn to appreciate life after falling in love with a woman, or having it be typically subverted by having the relationship fall apart and have him not learn anything, Up in the Air arguably takes a path that's more effective for this particular character. Which is that his attempt at true love ends in shambles, but he's still able to learn from it, realize how empty his life is, and come to see the value in human connection anyway, instead of being left angry, embittered, or disappointed by Alex's betrayal. He's not only left heartbroken, but resolves to be a better person from the experience. And once again, considering how the audience sees him at the beginning, and how by the end he's pretty much right back where he started and doesn't really stand to gain anything from such a mindset, it's way more effective at getting its point across than if it had followed a more typical story pattern. Because as a man who's actually written books, I can safely say that sometimes the best way to tell a story is to do what's best for the characters rather than try and follow a rigid story pattern that must be brought to its predetermined conclusion, whether it works for them or not. And this is something that Up in the Air understands perfectly. Because in order to get the point across that human connection is way more fulfilling than a seemingly perfect, detached existence, Ryan doesn't fall back into his previous mindset even when he has every reason to, and still learns the lesson he needed to anyway. Which honestly says a lot because it's coming from a man who absolutely loved his life at the beginning. But instead of defaulting back to it the moment his new point of view is challenged, he instead goes all the way with it regardless, and encourages the audience to do the same no matter how difficult it is. Sure, it's still not exactly the most uplifting story, but in this case it does a better job of getting the intended point across because he has every reason to discard everything he's learned but doesn't, because he's ultimately a better man than he makes himself out to be, even if it takes him a while to finally admit and embrace that. And that is honestly the best way to subvert any kind of story. Because as I just said, while it is a sadder outcome than is usual for that template, it does at least offer a silver lining and doesn't make things out and out tragic by making the whole experience turn out to be for nothing. And it's that very silver lining that makes the movie so effective in delivering its message. Because it shows that for all of his charisma, for all of his detachment, he was really just a lonely man trying not to admit that to himself by taking pleasure in the shallow things in life. And after coming to accept that that's no way to live, only to see what caused him to learn that fall apart, he doesn't take it out on the rest of the world, or use it as proof that his old way of thinking was right. Instead, he still learns from it and decides to be a better person going forward, because he's learned that embracing your emotions, even if it will inevitably hurt you, is way better than bottling them up in a misguided attempt to protect yourself. So while he does indeed regain his humanity and appreciation for human connection over the course of the story, it's in a very different way than is normally done. And as with any well-handled subversion, the results are very good ones at that. Okay, I think I've made my point with all of this. So now I'd like to hear what you think. Do you believe that Up in the Air does a really effective job of subverting a regaining humanity story? Or do you believe it isn't really a subversion at all? Or do you even think that it's not all that good in general? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as I always say, you do not have to agree with any of the more opinion-based parts of this video if you don't want to. You can feel about this or any other topic we discuss here that you want to, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you all next time.